Hello and welcome to the Tennessee Informer. Thank you all for joining us tonight. We're continuously told that school choice is a good thing and it's all about giving parents more control over the education of their children. It's also supposed to ensure that children get a good education. After all, everyone knows that our schools are failing and have become bastions of left-wing ideology such as DEI, CRT, and they promote the LGBTQ agenda. No longer do we have to worry just about our kids getting indoctrinated in college. Schools are starting a lot earlier now. Now, keep in mind that in most cases, the same state legislatures and governors that have allowed our schools to become chaotic and ineffective and in many cases outright dangerous now support giving yet even more tax dollars to parents to escape the schools, the government schools that they created in the first place. So supporters tell us that school choice is the remedy for failing schools or for children that need a different structure in order to learn. Many well-known conservative organizations support school choice. President Trump supports school choice, but do they really understand the goal of some of the global and national organizations that push school choice? What is the real agenda behind school choice? Our guest tonight, Tiffany Boyd, is extremely well-versed on the topic, and you might be shocked to hear what she has to say about the true motive behind the school choice push and the global elites behind it, as well as the support from well-respected conservative groups. Tiffany founded freeyourchildren.com, and she joins us to lay out the real goal and help connect the dots for us. But first, it's time for the Informer Report. The Trump administration has declared Antifa a terrorist organization. Finally. They're also going to invest Soros and others for funding terrorist organizations. Now, what about CARE and the Muslim Brotherhood? They definitely need to be added to that list. I wonder if they will cut the funding to universities that employ radical left-wing professors. We'll be hearing about more of this in the weeks to come. The Trump administration wants Bagram Air Base back because of its proximity to China's nuke bases. So China is a threat, but we still allow over 300,000 a year to attend our universities. Something's not adding up here. I'm missing something. So if we were to take over Bagram Air Base again, which the Afghanis have already said no, won't this also make our guys targets again? How much are we going to pay the Taliban to get the base back? How much of that will be used to fund terrorism? The whole idea is just crazy, if you ask me, and I hope we don't do it. You know, if we're worried, it makes no sense to me that we have to take over a base that's closer to China, yet we're still going to allow them here. We're still going to allow them in our universities, and they still have most favored nation status as far as trade goes. Doesn't add up to me. The Attorney General, Pam Bondi, should be fired. That's my opinion. She has shown that she doesn't understand or respect the Constitution by recently saying in an interview, there's free speech and there's hate speech. And there's no place, especially now, especially after what happened to Charlie, for that in our society. Now, I'm quoting her. We will absolutely target you, go after you if you are targeting anyone with hate speech. You know, it was terrible what happened to Charlie, but, you know, he was a big proponent of free speech. I don't think he believed in the concept of hate speech. Who gets to determine what hate speech is? This is a big concern. We really should be paying attention here. You know, she doesn't have that good of a record. Remember, she's not been very good on the Second Amendment. Now it sounds like she's not very good on the First Amendment either. In separate comments made on Fox News last Monday, the Attorney General threatened to prosecute Office Depot for allegedly refusing to print posters with photographs of Kirk for the slain for his vigil. Now, businesses, it's terrible that maybe they're not even-handed, but the government can't tell a private entity they have to do something. We've had enough of that on the left telling us, oh, you have to do this or we're going to sue you. But to have the governor or to have the government come after you, this is concerning. It definitely concerning. Now, there are things that are beyond the pale, okay? I mean, there are things you can't threaten people. Obviously, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. There is such thing as inciting a riot. So there are things you can't say. But when we go down the avenue of hate speech, that's a concern. That's a problem. Now, she also said that businesses cannot discriminate. Well, if you can't discriminate, then you don't have freedom of association. I think private businesses should be able to discriminate. And I really don't care on what basis they discriminate. I think that's part of being free, and if their decision is a bad one, the public will let them know it. If you want to go and print posters with Charlie's pictures on them for a vigil, you have to, this is her again, she's quoting that if somebody wants to print posters for a vigil, then you have to let them do that. No, if you're a private business and you don't want to do that, you shouldn't have to, just like you shouldn't have to make a cake for a gay couple. She said that you could be prosecuted for refusing to do that. She also added that the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division was looking at such a case with an Office Depot employee. In a statement posted to X, the Attorney General clarified remarks she made Monday, suggesting that hate speech was distinct from speech protected under the First Amendment. Now, she's backtracking here a little bit. Hate speech that crosses the line into threats of violence is not protected by the First Amendment, and that's true. The whole thing about hate speech is the concern, though. She says it's a crime. For far too long, we've watched the radical left normalize threats, call for assassinations, and cheer on political violence. However, those things that she just listed there, normalizing threats, call for assassinations, and cheer on political violence, that's not the end-all be-all in terms of describing hate speech. What she was describing as hate speech is still one of those fill-in-the-blank type deals, and that's what we don't want. So yes, there are certain things you can't say, but hate speech should not be the criteria, and the government should not necessarily be the one deciding unless you violate clearly. I mean, for instance, assault. Assault is not necessarily a physical assault. It can be even a credible threat of violence or intimidation. That's already a crime. She also added that free speech protects ideas, debate, even dissent, but it does not and will not ever protect violence. If I'm not mistaken, like I said, the threat of violence is already a crime that's known as assault. There's laws against inciting riots or calling for the overthrow of the government. Hard to believe a competent AG would confuse that with whatever she thinks is hate speech. Who gets to define hate speech again? Where does the federal government even get the right to prosecute someone for hate speech? Where does she get the authority to tell businesses that they have to do anything? She may have walked this back after catching flack from all corners on this, but the fact that she had to be called out is a problem. Trump hasn't given any indication that he has a problem with her statement, and that should be a concern for everybody. Troops in Memphis that we have there now, that's really a result of the failure of the governor and legislature to do its job. Now, this failure goes back decades. It's not just the current administration, the current legislature. Memphis has been a dangerous place for decades. Why has the state never used its power to go in there and help enforce the laws? Why have they allowed prosecutors that don't do their job to hold their job? Remember, the counties are a creation of the state. And the state it's not the same scenario as, with the U.S. government. The states created the federal government. That's not the same case at the state level. The state can force the counties to follow the state law, and that's what they should do. Also, a lot of people may welcome it right now. They say, hey, it's going to make things better. What about when the troops leave? If you haven't dealt with the core problems, when the troops leave, all the problems are going to come back. And that wraps up this installment of the Informer Report. If you have a news story that you want to alert us to, be sure to send us an email at tninformer.tv@gmail.com. Now a little about our guest. Tiffany Boyd started Free Your Children in 2020 because she's dedicated to sharing the truth in love about education and equipping parents to assume the biblical mandate of disciplining and teaching their own children. She holds a Bachelor of Sciences degree in Interdisciplinary Studies from MTSU, She's a former tenured public school teacher, a homeschool consultant, a speaker, a homeschool advocate, and founder and administrator of Free Your Children, an LLC, and she also does the Free Your Children podcast every week. In addition, she's a monthly contributor to the Murfreesboro Pulse. Tiffany and her team have also crafted legislation with the goal of protecting educational, parental, and constitutional rights here in Tennessee. She can be found often at the state capitol fighting for children and families. Well, thank you for being with us today. How's everything going?
Thank you for having me. We're doing well here in Middle Tennessee. Down south, it's rainy, so hopefully we don't have any interruption in service here if a storm pops up.
Yeah, we had some here too. Well, we definitely needed it. And same thing.
Yes.
I hope it doesn't take us out. So, hey, let's get started. Got a lot of ground to cover, and we want to cover as much as we can in the roughly hour that we have. So let's talk about the basic components behind school choice, the school choice agenda, the legs of it, so to speak.
Absolutely. I know that there are a lot of people, they've done a fantastic job with marketing and coining the term school choice, but I think that it is important for people to understand what school choice really is. It's government funded school choice. The goal behind this is to make all forms of education government controlled. And if the government is controlling and funding all forms of education, then what choice do we really have? And I would like to say that, I was the pioneer behind discovering all of this information, but there have been people long before me sounding the alarm about these initiatives. And one of those was Charlotte Iserbyt. And so the legs that you saw there on the stool are a throwback to the work that Charlotte did in the 80s when she worked for President Ronald Reagan in the Department of Education. And Charlotte was the consummate whistleblower. She was privy to this initiative. It was a polytechnical initiative that was going to create a global workforce. And of course, they were going to use this by training the children from cradle to grave. And of course, this could not be accomplished without school choice. And so she sounded the alarm. And of course, much like the treatment that we receive today when we're trying to educate people with a choice about school choice, there were people that were not happy that she was blowing the lid off of this. She was fired from her job. She was smart enough before she left to take the classified documents with her, and she compiled them in a book titled The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America. So if you have never read that book, I highly encourage you to do so. It's still out there in the public domain, and so you'll be able to read in detail exactly what it was that Charlotte was warning about. And unfortunately, everything that she has warned about is coming to fruition across the nation very rapidly now. Very rapid pace, especially now with the digitization of education. So before we get into the legs, I want to kind of set a stage here as to where this came from, where we are today, and where we're headed in the future. And it was a series of federal laws that were passed that pretty much paved the way for this to be ushered in. The first one was in 1965 with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. This allowed federal dollars to come back to the states to teach economically disadvantaged children how to read. And of course, we know what happened with that. Once the feds became involved, none of the children could read at that point. Okay?
Yeah. Funny how that works. Real quick, I do want to ask this. So the Reagan administration, nobody in the Reagan administration saw this as a problem?
Well, she asked a lot of questions of a lot of people within the Reagan administration. And again, this is all detailed in her book, The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America. I go into a lot of detail in one of the seminars that I do. Our team, we've been traveling across the states. Anytime we're invited to come in, we do a series of seminars. We just recently did a seminar up in Sumner County for the Sumner County Constitutional Republicans. That seminar was about the FREE Act that we ran last legislative session. We have been to Missouri. We've been to Alabama. We've been to a lot of different places. We've moved across the state of Tennessee to a plethora of different groups, and we've talked about our full seminar on school choice, which is really about 3 hours. And then we have lots of questions and answers after. And then we did a seminar in West Tennessee for the Tennessee Firearms Association. And that one focused on how our 2A rights are being destroyed via these initiatives. So if anyone is interested in more information about this, because tonight we're just going to be barely scratching the surface. And there's so many tentacles and legs to this. And I know it's a fire hose of information. And so some of our other seminars go into greater detail about each of these topics. So I guess you could say tonight I'm going to give you maybe the 100,000 view.
Wow.
Without trying to overwhelm you. So one of the things that I always like to do when I'm trying to explain to people why school choice is so concerning is to go over these federal laws. And yes, when Charlotte worked under Ronald Reagan, she went to several people within that department. She wrote letters to multiple different people asking questions and warning about this polytechnical initiative. And she was pretty much just told, go sit down.
Wow.
we don't really, or they ignored her, or, in the end, she wound up getting fired from her job. But in 1965, that really launched this, into the arena so that they could start initiating all of these things that we see happening today. But in 2002, the ESA bill, the EA bill, was reauthorized under Bush, and it was called No Child Left Behind. And you probably remember that. I know I remember it.
Yep.
And this mandated states to do testing and collect data. And then during this point in time, a national database was illegal. So statewide databases were set up to collect the data. And then in 2014, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act was signed under federal law, which binds education under the Department of Labor, the Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Defense, and the Department of Education. So now we have federal dollars coming back to the states through all of these departments, and even more so now, because within the research that I have done, I've seen grants coming back to the states to be used in education, through the infrastructures in the states and targeting the rural communities. So we've seen that as well. So there's so much money that's flowing into the states from multiple different departments that even though defunding the Department of Education sounds great, and that would be a step in the right direction, it is not going to change any of this unless they start repealing these federal laws, because there's too much money embedded within too many different federal departments. And I think that that's one thing people don't understand.
And I'm sure that's by design.
It is absolutely by design. So then in 2015, under Obama, the No Child Left Behind was reauthorized to the Every Student Succeeds Act. Yep. This mandates college and career readiness standards that are Common Core aligned, and they're aligned to UNESCO's global standards. And we're going to talk more about UNESCO as we move through here. Then this H.R. 5, which was known as the Every Student Succeeds Act, was passed by the United States Congress and signed into law by President Barack Obama on December the 10th, 2015. It replaced the previous education law, No Child Left Behind. This requires that states legislatively surrender their rights over education in order to receive Title I funds. And this makes every child in those schools considered at risk. So now I know that for years there was a socioeconomic status that was attached to those Title I funds.
Right.
So schools that were mainly being utilized by families who would be considered or qualified for free and reduced lunch, right, that would have been your schools that would have been Title I status. Once he reauthorized this, now there are schools that you would not expect to be receiving Title I funds that are doing just that. Right. I know in our county, in Murray County, a couple of years ago, one of the elementary schools in our area, and it's where everyone that moves to Murray County, they want to make sure they live in that particular zone so their children can go to that particular elementary school. And they have applied for and received Title I status. And it would be considered the wealthiest school in the county. So it's important for people to understand how those laws and how Title I and how the Every Student Succeeds Act has trapped us up in the mandates and the strings that come along with this money that is being poured into the schools through all these different departments.
Is the current administration, have they discussed repealing that law? Have you heard anything about that?
No. I have heard different people who have been on my podcast say that they had people who had direct lines to President Trump who had called them to have discussions about how they could make major gains in starting to untangle our nation and our individual states from these strings. And that was a conversation that no one seems to want to have. But until we start repealing these federal laws, nothing else is going to matter, because this is what gives them the foothold over the states and the control, over the states. And so when we showed the leg on the graphic that shows the 3 legs of school choice, Charlotte warned, she said, this is what's going to happen. And the first thing that they're going to do, the first leg, is going to include the partnership arrangement between schools and businesses. And it's going to launch pretty much this school to work, this brave new world where students are going to be trained for particular jobs and career paths, but they're also going to change and cultivate their attitudes and their values that are necessary, for them to be able to accept having their career chosen for them. And I have interviewed school board members that have told me now that this is happening in as early as 3rd grade in our school system. So children's career paths, their education is being customized for the job, for their future career.
So it's like an incremental lobotomy.
Absolutely. And so she warned about this in the 80s, that this is what was going to happen, that it was tied into the school to work. And I know in the state of Tennessee, we have poured in not too long ago an additional $500 million for this workforce development initiative through our schools in Tennessee. It's workforce training. It's actually the communist Pavlovian workforce training. That's what it is. I mean, you see this in other countries where children are told what they're going to be when they grow up. They're not given a choice. And so I think a lot of people unwittingly believe that this is the shop class that they had, in the 60s. This isn't that. This is not what this is. This is designed to create a global workforce. And they've tried this already in other countries, and now they're seeing that it has been devastating, because what happens if a child is trained to, let's just say, to be a welder, and then that particular skill is replaced by computers or machines in the future, and that's all they've been trained to do, and they haven't been given a broad-based education, then what are they going to do for the rest of their lives?
Right.
They're not going to have any other choice. So
on the funding, so a state, even if a state were to say, okay, we're not going to take any education funds because there's strings involved, even though you're supposedly getting rid of the department. I don't understand that whole thing, but anyhow, they would have to say no to all of these different monies that come from the federal government under all these different categories.
Yeah, they would have to make sure that they were not accepting any Title I funding for their school.
Okay.
And I have yet to know of any that are turning down, this funding. And part of the problem is during COVID with the ESSER funding, that was doled out to the schools. And so many of them, gladly accepted all of this funding. And then there were conditions attached to that funding. Again, the strings that are attached to taking that money. And one of the conditions was that they had to implement SEL in their curriculum. And so then, another condition of the ESSER funding was once the money runs out, you've started these programs, you can't drop the programs. It's then on you to continue funding the programs that you have initiated and started. So, schools have really gotten themselves backed up against a wall here. And, we know who funds all this. It's not the schools, it's the taxpayer.
Right. Talk a little bit about the SEL, because some people may not be familiar with SEL.
I've written extensively about social emotional learning and how, CASEL is behind this. And basically what it's doing, it's embedded in everything. It's embedded in all the digital curriculum in the school. So if your child is bringing home a Chromebook, it's embedded in the apps that they're utilizing. And what it's doing is it is changing or attempting to change and affect the thoughts, the beliefs, the attitudes, and the behaviors of your children, and conditioning them to believe what they being whoever's creating the program, want them to believe. But not only that, it's harvesting a vast amount of data, and they don't have to have your parental consent to do it, because Obama also reauthorized FERPA, which allows them the ability to collect this data and to share it with any entity in the name of educational research without parental consent. And so if you break down all of the different apps on these Chromebooks or whatever, digital device your child has been issued, each of those apps typically have FERPA disclaimers. So when you start utilizing those, you have then, entered into the realm of being data mined. And so again, if you want to check out my website, foryourchildren.com, you can click on the articles that I've written and you can find all the information there where I've gone into deep detail about this. SEL, Castle. Also, I have interviewed many guests where we've spoken about this in great detail as well, but it's not just some little feel-good program. It's something that they are initiating to be able to cultivate what we're talking about in this show today. They can't, if you just walked into a classroom and you started telling the kids, okay, you're going to be a janitor, you're going to be an attorney, you're going to be a welder, you're going to be a teacher. And these kids went home and said, hey, Mom, I was given my assignment for the rest of my life. There'd be a major outcry, right?
Right.
Parents would be like, what's going on? So they have to find a way to systematically be able to do this incrementally with the children so that they can condition them to be, good little global citizens in the future. So that's, another reason why it's so important. And Charlotte talked about that. We're actually going to get further into that as we go through what she warned about when she was sounding the alarm on school choice, which was, school choice is needed to implement this Pavlovian global workforce. So the first leg, again, was the workforce training education. So that was the first one. Then she went on to say that the second leg is going to be the ushering in of charter schools. Now, this has been a hot topic. Yep. I know in Murray County, there were folks that almost lost their mind because we pushed back so hard against charter schools. And if you claim that you are opposed to school choice, but you advocate and promote charter schools, then you are not opposed to school choice, because charter schools is part of school choice. And it is a very, very dangerous part of school choice, because with charter schools, they're supposed to be public schools. The taxpayers fund them, but there is absolutely zero accountability to the taxpayer. And then if you have kept up with anything that has happened in the state of Tennessee with charter school legislation, you will know that they created a charter school commission that was appointed by our governor. So now if the school board, if these charter schools apply, let's say in your county, a charter school applies and your school board says no, they vote it down. Okay, they do not feel like it's a good fit for your county. They can then apply to the appointed charter school commission and they can override your local school board's decision. And if the commission agrees that they are allowed to open, then they can open in your county on your dime.
Good Lord. Who agreed to that?
Yeah. So there's lots of people that are agreeing to charter schools, probably because they really don't understand what's happening here. And I have parents that contact me all the time that have enrolled their children in charter schools. They're having issues. They cannot get anyone at the school to listen to what they have to say. The school board meetings at that particular charter school aren't even sometimes available for the parents to find out what's going on. They really don't have, or feel like they don't have anyone that is listening to them. Then they've tried to go to their local school board and complain, and the school board says, hey, we don't have any jurisdiction over that charter school.
So they don't have any control over what they're being taught. They cannot complain about maybe something that they think's obscene or that's wrong, CRT, DEI. If the charter school is pushing that, they don't have any way to push back, right?
Right. And I think it's important for everyone to realize is once one charter school opens, then you cannot discriminate. So, there's a big push for, Hillsdale charter schools because it's supposed to be classical education. Well, I've read the applications for some of these schools and they're doing all the same things that the public schools are doing. Okay. But what you need to understand is once you've opened that Pandora's box, there are charter schools right now that are operational, one in particular that I've written about. And the whole charter school is based around SEL. They are very proud of the fact that everything in that school, all of their curriculum, has SEL embedded in it. And, you can read about that. Again, you can read about that. But there are also charter schools that cater to the LGBTQIA community. We have charter schools in Tennessee that were being run by Fethullah Gulen, who was a Muslim, and those are over in the Memphis area.
Yep.
I've written about that. In an article, we had lawmakers that took trips on, at the expense of Fethullah Gulen,
Yep.
and there was a piece of legislation during that period of time that they were trying to get passed that would override the local school board's control, which we passed. And so these particular legislators went to Turkey, on his dime as this piece of legislation was filed. So it's pretty interesting when you start watching.
Any of those legislators still in office?
Yes.
Can you name them?
Yes, they are. I don't have the article in front of me, but I know the ones that took the trip. One was Kelsey, who was arrested and sentenced to prison and then Trump pardoned. He was one, Brian Kelsey. Right. Terry Lynn Weaver was one, and I believe Mark White. I have that article. I don't have it in front of me, and you probably can't pull it up, but it is legislators take trip to Turkey. And that one's on the Borough Pulse. It's also on my website, and you can find it on freeyourchildren.com. You can also find it on my website. But it goes into great detail about what that network. It's a huge charter school network, and where they are operational, and right. What has happened with that. But it was very interesting to me. And when I penned that article, that piece of legislation had been filed, and of course I reached out to legislators then and said, I really would like for you to vote no on this piece of legislation, and here's why. And it didn't get very much attention, we should say, and then it wound up passing. But Charlotte warned about the charter school network and said that it's not just about the charter schools. What they're trying to get you to do is they are trying to condition you to accept this form of governance, regionalism, where there is only appointed boards and not elected boards. And we see that in education across the board and in other forms of government where they will appoint boards to make decisions for our state, and the taxpayer has, no say so whatsoever. So once they get, here was the goal. Schools are an abysmal failure. They're really not. They're doing exactly what they were intended to do. If we go back and talk about, what we adopted, here in America, that model of education, it's actually doing exactly what it was supposed to do. Right. But for people, a conservative, they see that as a failure because their children aren't being educated. They're not learning what they want them to learn. Right. That was never the reason why your modern day, school system that we have today, your institutionalized educational system was created. It was created to make worker bees.
Yep.
And that's what they're doing. And they're using this to do just that. But Charlotte said, people are going to start waking up, and they're going to be really concerned about what they see in the educational system, and they're going to want change, and they will take the first thing that's thrown at them, and it will be done via charter schools. Wow. And so what they will do is they will start to condition people into believing that regionalism is acceptable, and that it will expand into other areas of the government, which is exactly what we see here in our home state of Tennessee, but we also see across the nation. So that was the second leg of school choice. And then you go on to the third leg, which is citizens are considered human resources under UNESCO's lifelong education. It is under the umbrella of the unelected using Skinnerian, Pavlovian, operant conditioning. How are they going to do this? They're going to do this via computers. So as we just talked about, this is the digitization of schools. In order for them to be able to condition children to serve, this global workforce, they're going to have the digitization of schools, which is exactly what we have now. Right. And so, that's what's allowing us to get this push so far down the road, is that all the legs of the stool are complete now, because the goal of all of this is just what the graphic says. government control over private education. That is still your last frontier of freedom. If you have your kids in private school and the government is not funding it, or your children are being homeschooled and you're paying for it out of your pocket and the government can't control, what that education looks like, then you're still, in the freedom frontier over here. Well, in order to create a global workforce, you have to have a way to get all of the kids under that umbrella.
Right.
And so they have to have school choice to do that. So some people may not know what UNESCO is. UNESCO is the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. What they want is one world curriculum, a global workforce, and government-controlled private education. And you will see on the screen here, Corey DeAngelis, some of you may know him. He is the self-proclaimed school choice evangelist. And he doesn't like answering the questions as to why he was listed on UNESCO's website as an inclusive policy lab expert. And so people who have asked him this question, such as myself, have wound up getting blocked and canceled from speaking engagements where he is going to be present. So pretty interesting that people like Corey do not want to have these discussions or debates about their associations with, an organization that wants one world, curriculum, a global workforce, and to control our educational system. He was also the poster boy for American Federation for Children. He actually worked for them under Betsy DeVos, because we know that that's her, brainchild there. And he no longer works for that organization, I do not believe, because there was a scandal that came out not long ago that made national news about his proclivities prior to him being placed in that position that he also doesn't seem to like to discuss anymore.
And those were filmed proclivities, correct?
Yes, they were. He was apparently a gay porn star using the name Seth Rose. And so those videos were leaked and photos were leaked. And he went silent for a long time. American Federation, or several days, American Federation for Children seemed to drop him. And then after some silence, he came forward and made a statement about that particular time in his life. And I think for a lot of people, they were concerned, myself included. It wasn't that he was not honest about that up front. He didn't come on the scene and divulge that he had been involved in all of these things and that he had changed his lifestyle and he had, decided that, he felt like that was wrong and he needed to repent or whatever. Instead, it was never brought up until he was caught and it was made public. And then it seemed that, again, he just disappeared and then he came back and now he's back on the center stage and he's the poster boy for the conservatives once again, promoting this school choice. He was photographed not long ago. I shared this on my social media pages, Moms for Liberty.
Wow.
At some big event. And so this is concerning in and of itself because of his associations with UNESCO, but also his associations with Betsy aren't much more encouraging as well. But I also thought it's important to point out here that American Federation for Children, they actually had a report that was created that promoted DEI. And it was a report for school leaders on how to implement DEI. And I've written about this, and there's a link attached to the article on the Borough Pulse. And we're going to talk about that as we move through here. But we know that Betsy, who was, the founder of American Federation for Children, they also founded some charter schools, and they were credited with being one of the architects of Detroit's charter school system. So very much into the school choice movement via charter schools, and they are huge proponents of school choice and promoting that agenda across the nation.
So now, was DeVos pushing DEI, or you're saying the American Federation for Children was pushing DEI?
Yes, the American Federation for Children actually created the report. And that is in one of the articles that we're going to talk about as we move through your show here. But you had asked me, there's always a question. who are the organizations that are behind the push
Right.
for school choice? Well, there are so many, but I did make a list of a few that I thought it may be interesting to discuss tonight. Of course, everyone, if you've been awake at all and paying any attention in Tennessee, especially to what has been happening with school choice, you already know that Americans for Prosperity was a huge player for school choice. You know, we were there at the Capitol both years that they were trying to get school choice legislation passed. So we were there with AFP, Americans for Prosperity. What you may not know is they're funded by the Koch brothers, and AFP actually endorsed Nikki Haley, and they are a huge lobbyist for school choice, not just in the state of Tennessee, but all across the nation. Yeah, everywhere. Of course, you know, when you have a lot of money, you're able to do that. But there are other organizations that you know, as we move through, you're probably going to recognize their name, and you may not know that they too are tied to this network of the, you know, propagating school choice. And one is the Herzog Foundation. They have been big participants in Missouri's Mo Scholars voucher program through their Herzog Tomorrow Foundation. They are a significant force for pushing for school choice. You will also find that Focus on the Family has promoted school choice, and their affiliate, Alaska Family Council, used a data mining tool developed by Koch for fundraising and advocacy.
Is there any way that they don't know that UNESCO is pushing this stuff?
I don't know. But this Focus on the Family has also been funded by DeVos as well. Then you have the Bradley Foundation, and they have funded Heritage. And I also want to, the Heritage Foundation, and I also want to back up and talk about Focus on the Family a little bit more, because Focus on the Family, they have the Family Policy Alliance,
right,
and it organized something called SoCon. And they had, it was a conference, and they had Betsy was featured, and they also formalized partnerships with the Heritage Foundation and Americans for Prosperity. So again, you're going to see the same names in these circles all playing ball together. And of course, they have one goal, which is within this arena, which is to continue the march, you know, toward school choice and the globalization of education. Then you have ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. And of course, our state chair of ALEC is Chris Todd. They're funded by the Koch brothers. They're also funded by Betsy. What ALEC is a corporate funded charity which pays for lawmakers lucrative trips where they leave ready to pass these model bills. And so that's kind of a term that's been coined by media outlets for this particular.
But most people think that ALEC is conservative. And that's what most people think that.
That's what most people think. But if you look, you can see right here on the screen that they were advocating, you know, for school choice. The GOP platform calls for universal school choice. So they go on to talk about, you know, how it's your money, how it's your children and your choice for where they want to go. But they're not addressing the core of this, which is it's not just your money, it's everyone else's money too that you're then getting back in some way,
right, yeah,
to be used to pay for private education. Yeah. And again, once again, there is no choice when all choices are government controlled.
Right. And I got a question now. If it's my money, then when my kids are no longer in public schools, then if by that logic, I should be getting a check, right?
Absolutely.
If it's my money and my kids are not
yep.
in school. Yeah, I mean, it just seems that way. It's just,
well, when you look at it from that perspective, too, for those of us that have homeschooled, we've homeschooled for 22 years. We don't utilize that system and haven't for 22 years. And we've self-funded our own children's private education via homeschooling. So we haven't utilized any of those services, but we're not getting any of our money back. And you know what? Our state constitution clearly states that we are required via our state constitution to provide a free public education to children in the state of Tennessee. So I think that's something, you know, that people need to understand. It doesn't say anything about a private education.
And, and the fact that they want to fund additional outlets when their primary responsibility is, according to their own words, failing. Correct. Okay? It's failing, and in some cases it's dangerous, depending on where you live. yet somehow we're supposed to trust them when they're going to use more of our money to fund something else.
Yes. And I say often, you don't trust the government to educate your children in the system that they are tasked with overseeing. So now you want to trust the government to be over private education. Make that make sense.
Good point. Good point.
Yeah. I mean, we keep coming back to, and then as a taxpayer, if you're looking at this, now you're going to be forced to fund multiple avenues of education. You're going to be forced to fund traditional public schools. You're going to be forced to fund charter schools. And now you're going to be forced to fund private education via the Education Freedom Scholarship Act. And that's only going to increase because Michael Lotke with Americans for Prosperity has already posted on social media that something is coming, something more is coming with school choice, as we move into the next legislative session. And we know that something is likely. They're going to try once again to get homeschoolers caught up in the trap of school choice because we've always been the goal. They've made that clear from the very beginning that they want this offered to homeschoolers. And the reason why they do, again, is because right now they can't control us.
Right.
But if just a few homeschool families, that's all it takes. When that first homeschool family starts to take school choice money, then that opens the government overreach for all of us. And so that's why it's such a threat. And then again, these private schools that are on the list now on the Tennessee.gov website, outlining, the list of schools that's going to accept the Education Freedom Scholarship dollars.
Right.
Those schools are now only private schools in name only.
Yep. Yep.
Because the government is going to control them.
And they're not wanting to be honest about who's getting this. It's really a subsidy, and most of it, from what we can tell, has gone to, I think this was predicted that something like 65% of the money would go to families who already had kids in private schools. So it's basically just a subsidy for them.
It is. And then I think it's really important, and this is happening all across the nation, but we live in Tennessee. So let's talk about what's happening in Tennessee. The State Policy Network is directly involved in this huge push for school choice in Tennessee. Of course, they're funded by the Heritage Foundation. They're also partners with the Beacon Institute. They're funded by the Koch brothers. They're major drivers behind ALEC. They also promote DEI. And I wrote an article. I have an excerpt from it right here in my notes. And I talked about this because the State Policy Network and the Beacon Center of Tennessee actually held a webinar that I attended. And I spoke about that just a second ago. But this whole purpose of this webinar was to legislatively create a carve out to protect these private-public partnerships, these micro schools, these vendors that are going to apply for these Education Freedom Scholarship dollars. They already know that they need to protect them legislatively. So they created this webinar to talk about these things. But it was pretty interesting to see that Beacon, they're working with the Institute for Justice, which is funded by Bill and Melinda Gates and Charles Koch, and Ed Choice, who works closely with the American Legislative Exchange Council. Again, ALEC. And then if you read this article where I talk about this, I list who some of the other actors are that are involved in the push for school choice. But it was really interesting to me that in this webinar, they highlighted something called the Lab School of Memphis and its founder, Coy Moorfield. And so I went and researched exactly what this school was doing. And so this would be a school that we would be funding. If they apply to accept the Education Freedom Scholarship dollars, which they very much want to do, then your tax dollars would be funding this school. And so they talk about how they invest a good deal. It says what they're doing here is they're implementing DEI in all of their curriculum. So it was very interesting to see that. Again, if you haven't read it, and to me it was interesting because there's been a lot of fanfare surrounding, Trump and his administration and the dismantling of DEI and their policies. And now we see the state of Tennessee creating webinars to protect micro schools who are going to be utilizing DEI within their curriculum, and our tax dollars are going to be funding it.
We spent the last, I don't know how many years supposedly pushing against CRT, DEI, and they passed these bills without any teeth. Or in the case of, in Williamson County right now, there's a case. As a matter of fact, Representative Bolsa, who I had on the show a few weeks ago, he was saying, well, we passed a law where in these cases where in schools, if there's a transgender situation, that boy is not going to be allowed in girls' functions. Well, okay, the law allows for a private suit. So the state passes a law. They won't enforce their own law. But you know what? If a parent wants to sue, hey, we've arranged. That's crazy. They won't enforce their own laws, but families have to go spend their money to sue the district for violating a state law.
Absolutely. And I found the quote here that I wanted to read. So this school, they use Me Among the Trees. It's a nature-based curriculum steeped in anti-bias, anti-racist values of identity, diversity, justice, and activism.
Little Antifas.
So these are the types of programs that the state of Tennessee is going to be funding through these Education Freedom Scholarship Acts. And then, talking about some more major players, one was Alliance Defending Freedom. They were here promoting their fake parental rights bills, what we like to call it, because I warned everyone, we pushed back against that bill because we said consistently, any government large enough to enumerate parental rights was a government large enough to take those rights away. So they came back the next legislative session and they amended those rights. And in one of my seminars that I do, I talk about the amendments that they made. And one of those was, we have the right to video your child now, but don't worry, we won't share it with anyone. We have the right to give them a Band-Aid and additional treatment that we deem necessary. So again, once you allow a government to start to enumerate parental rights, it's very, very easy for them to start chipping away then because you've enumerated them. And of course, we know that Alliance Defending Freedom also has ties to ALEC as well. So all of these organizations are working together. And I think that people just haven't, it's a web. It's a tangled web. And I think that you need to understand that what we are marching toward is this globalization of education. And UNESCO says right here that they want to deliver on goal 4, which is education financing must become a national investment priority. Furthermore, measures such as making education free and compulsory, increasing the number of teachers, improving basic school infrastructure, and embracing digital transformation are essential. Because again, in order to create a global workforce, you have to make sure that, everything is equal across the board and it's all the same with your national assessments, your national standards, which then become, worldwide, them deciding, the attitudes, the beliefs, and the values that they want our children, to have and adopt. And then, of course, they will very easily create this cradle to grave, global workforce that will benefit them. And you will see in every single state, we have school districts and what they're doing is they're partnering with, local businesses in their area. And of course, that's benefiting them. So they are creating, a workforce for these private public partnerships.
So we've got Focus on the Family, we've got Alliance Defending Freedom, we've got Heritage, AFP, which is no surprise. I don't consider them conservative, never have. And who was the other one?
You've got the Herzog Foundation, you've got Focus on the Family, you've got
Hillsdale. Did you say Hillsdale?
ALEC. You've got ALEC. Well, Hillsdale has a network called the Barney Initiative, which is where they're setting up charter schools, as many as, they could get passed and are allowed to open up that are popping up everywhere. We had one attempt to set up in Murray County, and of course that was voted down. Then they appealed to the Charter School Commission. They told them no. I'm certain at some point they'll probably try to come back. Murfreesboro has a Hillsdale affiliate charter there. They have a couple of other charters. Those charter schools alone have already exceeded the budget that was, initially what they claimed that they were going to need. They've already gone over that by millions just for the 3 charter schools that are already operational in Rutherford County.
Wow.
And
So,
again, I've written about that extensively too.
okay, so we can't trust anybody. If everything if everything you're telling me is true, and I have no reason to believe it's not, I mean, I don't have too many bubbles left to bust in terms of organizations and federal entities or you name it. So what do we do to stop all this?
Well, I think one thing that we need to be doing as citizens is doing everything we can to protect our private education, to protect homeschooling, to protect our private schools. There's going to be a push to swallow up as many areas of private education as possible. And that's why last legislative session, we wrote the bill, the FREE Act. And, we tried as hard as we could to get that carve out, because that particular category for homeschoolers in the state of Tennessee was going to be a category that would not be taking any government funding at all. So if you chose that category to educate your child, then that category would not have been eligible for any government funding. It would have also taken us out of having to register our children with the state, so we would not be held to compulsory attendance laws.
Right.
And of course, I've written, about that extensively too, because they're using the compulsory attendance laws and truancy to trap parents up in the juvenile justice system and, remove children from the homes. Children are worth a lot of money to the state. Schools lose money when children aren't in the seats.
Yep.
And so I think parents need to understand that none of this is about, school choice was never about helping underprivileged children. It was never about helping children. It is about global control, and it's about money. There is tons of money surrounding all of this, and tons of money to be made. And school choice actually touches every facet of our lives. I interviewed a guest named John Klizek, who wrote School World Order, and he talks about how all of this is tied to, social credit scores and digital currencies, and none of this can happen without them ushering in universal school choice. And that's why they're trying so hard to push these initiatives through, and they're spending so much money and so much time. And I tell people all the time, don't take my word for it. Don't say Tiffany Boyd said. I encourage you to go do your own research about these organizations. If you have questions about the history of school choice, about who's been behind the movement, you need to understand that it's not just Republicans that have been invested in school choice. Democrats have been invested in school choice as well, and they've done things to advance it. I told you when Obama changed, No Child Left Behind to the Every Student Succeeds Act,
right,
that ushered in a lot of this. Bill Clinton, also helped move things along in the 90s. So this is not just something that the Republicans have been on board with, although the Republicans have definitely picked it up as their mantle now. And so it's really become one of the cornerstones of the Republican Party, which is extremely disappointing, because now with the relationships and the partnerships that it looks like we're trying to build with Palantir and, creating this, huge database, which is going to be able to collect vast amounts of data. And then they're wanting to partner with all of these, major federal departments. Every citizen should be concerned about what the implications of that are going to look like. I mean, there's so much going on in so many areas. And I knew when we had this conversation that it was going to be, 100,000-foot view, because there are so many little intricacies involved in, everything that we talked about tonight that help to expound upon all of this.
Right. Well, so far there's nothing good, but there's a lot of bad and ugly. Have you got any closing thoughts? Anything you needed to cover that we didn't get a chance to?
Yes, I would just say, understand that school choice is so much more than just one vote. There are a lot of pieces of legislation that have been passed in previous legislative sessions that are paving the way and helping to advance these initiatives. So I would say, watch your legislation if it has to do with workforce training, career development, if it has to do with the digitization of schools, charter schools, Education Freedom Scholarship Act, tax credits, vouchers, ESAs, all of those things should sound the alarm, because that is part of the globalization of education that's going to lead to this, global workforce and pretty much global control, because that's the goal.
And the best thing our state could do is repeal the law they passed last year on this, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. That's one step in the right direction. And then, I would really like to see them repeal the unconstitutional rules and regulations and laws that we have around homeschooling and private education, because none of those are constitutional, because none of it's mentioned in our state constitution.
Right. Right.
So,
Yeah.
because they don't have any jurisdiction over private education as it stands.
Yeah. Well, our legislature is kind of like the Congress. They really don't pay much attention to the Constitution. They just ignore it.
Exactly.
Unless they are trying to make an argument and act like they're defending it. Then they'll
Absolutely.
mention it, and that's about the only time they'll mention it. So
It was pretty interesting to us last legislative session, because our bill was going to do exactly what they claimed that they stood for. It was going to give parents choice, real choice.
Right.
It was going to put parents in the driver's seat of their child's education.
Yeah.
It was going to allow parents, who they claim is the most equipped to make those decisions for their children, it was going to allow them to be able to do that. Yet all of the Republicans on the education subcommittee voted it down.
wow. Thank you for being with us, and let's pull up your
Absolutely.
website again. freeyourchildren.com. And you have a lot of information on there, and you do a weekly podcast, so I'm sure those are there as well. And if anybody needs to get more, and like you said, this is just the 1,000-foot view or 10,000-foot view, a lot more details on your site. Any upcoming events, or are you going to be speaking anywhere?
Yes, I'm going to be in the Memphis area in October. Those details haven't been made public yet, but they're coming. You can find that information out on our website. We also have a free newsletter. We also have Substack. So go to our website and sign up for our free newsletter. We also send out, more up-to-date information there as things are developing in real time. So thank you so much for having me here. It was great to be here again. I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, hey, thank you for being with us, and a lot of information. Appreciate what you do. Keep doing it.
Thank you. Thank you.
I want to thank the audience for taking the time to watch our program tonight. It doesn't cost anything to subscribe, so please be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons, as well as the notification bell, so you never miss an episode. We appreciate your support. Thanks again to Jonathan and Mary for their financial support for the month of July, August, and September. We really appreciate it. Check out our audio podcast on iHeartRadio, Spotify, and other platforms as well. Sign up for our weekly newsletter at our website, teeninformer.com. Find and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Have a few announcements. The TFA in Cookeville will host TNCSS speaker, which TNCSS is Tennessee Citizens for State Sovereignty, speaker Danny Blitz, to discuss nullification September 29th from 6 to 8 p.m. at Logan's Roadhouse, 1395 Interstate Drive in Cookeville. Should be a great presentation, by the way. Meet and greet with Monty Fritz. If you have not heard Monty Fritz speak, you need to go hear him. We had a great event last week in Lawrenceburg. He did an excellent job. And hey, guess what? When he's finished, he actually takes questions from the crowd. And he doesn't have to have somebody that approves them first. He just takes them, whatever they are. He does a great job. Anyway, meet and greet Monty Fritz, Wednesday, October 1st, 6:30 to 8:30 at 1900 South Germantown Road, Germantown, Tennessee. On Thursday, October 2nd, the Stewart and Henry TFA will meet at the VFW in Paris, 7 p.m. for our monthly meeting. Topic is the Bill of Rights. This is at 2512 Eastwood Street. You don't have to be a member to attend. Love to see you come there. The Tennessee Constitutional Grassroots Coalition will host Freedom Fest Saturday, October 4th from 12 to 8 p.m. at the Tate and Lyle Performing Arts Center, 1470 Robertson Spring Road in Loudon, Tennessee. Go to tcgc1776.org for tickets. Will Bolton is challenging Mark Cochran in District 23 next year. Tune in tonight for our second show at 8:30 to find out what he believes and is willing to fight for. Manufactured Crisis, The War to End America author James Simpsons joins us. He is an economist, and he will join us next week at 7 p.m. Now, this guy was in the Reagan, Bush, and Clinton White House. He explains the enemy and the methods being used to destroy our country, some of which we just talked about. He talks about the origins of the enemy, which began over 100 years ago. You'll learn things in this episode that you likely never knew about. For our second show next week, Colonel, retired U.S. Army Ed Kennedy joins us to expose Taliban tie, and other bad actors from the Naming Commission, and what can be done about their un-American actions. Also, next Sunday at 2 o'clock, we'll have George Malden, retired Colonel George Malden. He's got a new book out, and we'll talk about not only that book, but his other book, his experience, his whole time, his 32 years in the military. That will be here this Sunday, 2 p.m. Hope you can join us. That's it for now. Good night from Paris, Tennessee, that is.